Traoré just built what Europe couldn't in 100 years. Burkina's new railway is insane. This is a single train horn echoing across a station in Bobo-Dioulasso. But this isn't just any locomotive pulling in. This is a brand new, state-of-the-art machine delivered in February 2026, capable of hauling 1,500 tons of cargo at once. For anyone who has followed Burkina Faso's story, the truth is almost unbelievable. This country, landlocked, sanctioned, cut off from half its old allies, is now rebuilding a railway system that colonial France barely touched in over 60 years of control. In this video, we're going to look at exactly what's real, what's coming, and why this railway push has become one of the most closely watched infrastructure stories in the entire Sahel. Let's start with what actually exists on the ground right now. Burkina Faso's entire rail network is a single meter gauge line, just 622 kilometers long, running from Kaya in the north down through Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso to the Ivorian border, where it connects to the port of Abidjan. That's it. That's the whole network. It was built to move raw materials out, not to move a modern economy forward. For over 100 years, this narrow, low-capacity track has been the country's only rail lifeline to the sea, since Burkina Faso, like Mali and Niger, has zero coastline of its own. And here's the part that made Traoré furious enough to act. As recently as 2024, no modern locomotive could physically run on these tracks. The rails were so degraded and outdated that Burkina Faso was locked out of using the very equipment that could modernize its own economy. You cannot build an industrial nation on a railway that can't carry industrial machinery. That was the exact problem Traoré set out to solve, and it's worth remembering just how thin this network really is compared to the size of the country. Burkina Faso covers roughly 274,000 square kilometers, and its entire rail footprint barely stretches 622 kilometers, all of it concentrated on a single corridor in the west and south. Vast stretches of the north and east, the very regions hit hardest by insecurity and food shortages, have never had a single meter of track. If you wanted to move grain, fuel, or troops into those regions at scale, you were stuck with trucks on roads that flood every rainy season. That single point of failure is exactly what this railway push is trying to end. In September 2024, marking 2 years since he took power, Captain Traoré went on national radio from the Kuluba Palace and laid out his vision. He didn't talk about applying for a World Bank loan or waiting on a foreign contractor. He talked about building a rail production plant on Burkinabe soil, a facility that would manufacture the country's own standard-compliant rails, staffed entirely by Burkinabe workers. The logic was blunt. If you don't control the steel under your own trains, you don't control your own transport network, no matter how many locomotives you buy. That single announcement reframed the entire conversation. This wasn't going to be a repair job on old French infrastructure. This was an attempt to build sovereign rail capacity from the ground up, the same doctrine that has already driven Burkina Faso's road building and agricultural pushes. Notice the pattern here, because it's the same one running through every major project this government has launched. Cut out the intermediary, own the machinery, own the materials, own the workforce. When Traoré talks about rail, he isn't just talking about laying track. He's talking about controlling the entire supply chain behind that track, from the raw steel to the person operating the drill press. That's a much harder problem than simply signing a construction contract. But it's also the only version of sovereignty that doesn't quietly slide back into dependency the moment the next loan comes due. Ambition is one thing, funding is another. And this is where 2026 becomes the real turning point. Burkina Faso's government has committed just over $53 million, specifically to railway projects starting this year, according to the Minister of Infrastructure and Accessibility, Adama Luke Sorgo. That funding is tied directly to a local job creation program, meaning Burkinabe engineers and workers, not foreign firms, are meant to staff the build-out. Partnerships with private investors are reportedly being explored too. But the anchor financing is domestic. Compare that to the old model. For generations, any rail upgrade in this region meant a loan from a multilateral bank, foreign engineers flown in, and years of negotiation before a single tie was laid. $53 million isn't a continent-shaking number on its own. But it's the first real domestic capital commitment this country has ever made to its own rail network, and it's designed to seed a much larger build-out in the years that follow. There's also a resource angle that makes this funding push especially strategic. In the north of the country, near the borders with Mali and Niger, sits the Tambao manganese deposit, estimated to hold around 100 million tons of ore, a mineral essential to steel production. For years, developing that deposit meant nothing without a way to move the ore out, and that meant rail. Investors involved in the Tambao project have talked about an integrated package, combining the mine itself with new roads, a rail spur, and port access, in a package reportedly worth close to $1 billion over the coming years. If that link ever gets built, it wouldn't just export raw manganese. It would hand Burkina Faso a direct incentive to keep expanding its own rail network deeper into its most resource-rich and most conflict-affected territory at the same time. While the bigger construction plans are still taking shape, something concrete already happened on the tracks that exist today. In February 2026, in Bobo-Dioulasso, the country's minister overseeing national construction, Mikhailou Sidibe, officially commissioned 4 brand-new locomotives for Traoré, the company that operates the Abidjan-Ouagadougou line. These are GL30 class machines, each putting out 3,000 horsepower, and capable of hauling loads up to 1,500 gross tons. That's a serious jump in hauling capacity on a line that has historically been slow, narrow, and chronically underpowered. It might not sound as dramatic as an 8-lane highway carved out of the desert in 40 days, but for a landlocked country whose entire export economy depends on getting goods to a coastline hundreds of kilometers away, more horsepower on the only rail corridor to the sea is not a small thing. Every extra ton those trains can pull is one less truck grinding down a highway, one less bottleneck squeezing the price of fuel, fertilizer, and food across the entire country. Picture the difference on the ground. A single GL30 locomotive hauling 1,500 tons in one run replaces what could be dozens of heavy trucks on the exact same highway corridor that Burkina Faso has been so aggressively paving in recent years. Fewer trucks means less wear on those brand new roads, less fuel burned per ton of cargo moved, and fewer trucks stuck in the mud during rainy season, which for years has been one of the quiet choke points strangling this country's food and fuel supply chains. Rail and road aren't competing projects here. They're two halves of the same national logistics strategy, and this is the first real evidence that the rail half is starting to catch up. Here's a twist that complicates the zero foreign involvement narrative you might expect. In May 2025, the World Bank approved a project specifically aimed at strengthening climate-resilient road and rail infrastructure in Burkina Faso, part of what's known as the SK-BO initiative. The World Bank's own country manager for Burkina Faso called it a step toward reducing service interruptions and improving the reliability of the existing rail and road network. So the picture here isn't as simple as pure self-reliance versus total foreign dependence. It's a mixed model. Traoré's government is pushing hard on domestic financing and a homegrown rail industry, while simultaneously accepting selective international partnerships where they don't come with the kind of political strings that define the old aid relationships. Whether that balance holds, or whether Ouagadougou eventually leans further toward full self-financing, is one of the more interesting open questions in this entire story. It's a useful reminder that the zero foreign involvement narrative you hear around Burkina Faso's road building doesn't map perfectly onto its rail strategy. Roads have largely been built through the Faso-Mayabo model, using domestic labor, state-owned machinery, and citizen contributions. Rail is a different animal. Track gauge standards, signaling systems, and locomotive manufacturing require a level of specialized industrial capacity that doesn't yet exist inside the country. So instead of shutting every foreign partner out entirely, the government appears to be selectively accepting financing and technical partnerships, from the World Bank on resilience funding, from Traoré's parent company on rolling stock, while reserving the long-term goal of domestic rail manufacturing for itself. It's a more pragmatic version of sovereignty than the all-or-nothing framing you often hear in political speeches, and arguably a more sustainable one. Now, here's where you have to zoom out. Burkina Faso doesn't exist in isolation anymore. Since 2024, It's part of the alliance of Sahel states, alongside Mali and Niger, after all three countries withdrew from ECOWAS, and rail plans across the region increasingly seem to be pointing toward each other. There's a long-standing regional proposal, sometimes called the West African Rail Loop, that would eventually connect Abidjan, Ouagadougou, Niamey, Cotonou, and Lomé on standard gauge track, giving landlocked Burkina Faso and Niger access to multiple ports instead of relying on a single, vulnerable corridor through Abidjan. There's also a long-discussed Ghana-Burkina Faso rail interconnectivity project, which would open up a second route to the coast, entirely bypassing Côte d'Ivoire. None of these regional projects are finished, and most are still in feasibility or early design stages, with target windows stretching out toward 2030 and beyond. But the direction is unmistakable. Three allied, landlocked Sahelian states are all quietly angling their infrastructure toward each other and toward alternative ports, reducing their historical dependence on any single corridor, and by extension, any single set of foreign gatekeepers. So let's go back to the claim in the title. What did Europe actually build here in 100 years? A single 622-kilometer extractive line laid under colonial rule, designed to move raw cotton and minerals to a port, never meaningfully upgraded, never handed the modern locomotives it needed, and never connected to a wider domestic industrial plan. That's the baseline Traoré inherited in 2022. What's happening now is smaller, in raw kilometers, than the 8-lane highway project or the agricultural offensive we've covered in other videos. It's still mostly in the funding and planning phase, rather than steel in the ground. But it represents something the old colonial era line never had: a stated ambition to control the manufacturing of the rails themselves, a real financial commitment starting this year, upgraded rolling stock already running today, and a regional web of rail ambitions that, for the first time, actually points towards Sahelian neighbors instead of exclusively toward a single coastal metropole controlled by a former colonial power. Whether Burkina Faso can pull off a genuinely sovereign rail manufacturing industry is still an open question. Rail production is a serious industrial undertaking, and turning a radio address into working steel mills will take years, not months. But the direction of travel, pun very much intended, is clear. This is a country trying to make sure that the next 100 years of its railway history look nothing like the last 100. Outro. We'll be tracking every stage of this rail build-out as new funding, new track, and new locomotives roll in. If you want to see how this fits into the bigger infrastructure story, including the highway project and the agricultural offensive reshaping this country at the same time, check out the videos on your screen right now. See you there.